Hello everyone, my name is Tim Jarrock and this is my final mapping presentation for Geography 356 for the spring of 2015 at Grand Valley State University. My mapping presentation is going to be on guns in Europe and its correlation to murder. So introduction to this project. The goals for this project were to take two location quotients, in my case guns and murder, and compare and contrast them in Europe. So what is a location quotient? Let's start there. A location quotient is a way of quantifying how concentrated a particular industry, cluster, occupation, or demographic group is in a region as compared to the nation. It can reveal what makes a particular region unique in comparison to the national average. I took this quote from economicmodeling.com. So essentially a location quotient is a set of data that's been normalized against a region, and then when we look at that data we can look for outliers, and it can tell us significant or insignificant trends in the data. So my hypothesis, why did I come up with guns and murder? So we frequently hear, at least I do as a gun owner, that less guns means less murder. So people always say, well, in Europe they don't have guns, and in Europe there's less murder. So I wanted to look at the data and see if this statement is true. So I did some preliminary research into this, and I found some very interesting data. So looking at this relationship between gun ownership and firearm homicide rate, there's this study by Michael Siegel, Craig S. Ross, and Charles King III. They published this in the American Journal of Public Health in 2013. And so their study found that for each 1-point percentage increase in proportion of household gun ownership, there was a 9/10 of an increase in firearm suicide rates. So every 1-point increase in gun ownership correlated to more firearm suicides. But that's an interesting question that presents us because that's suicide by firearm. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there were more suicides simply by the presence of more guns. So we'll talk about that more later. But that's suicides, not murders. And the saying that we always hear is guns cause more murders. So what does this study tell us about murders? So the same study found that for a 19% reduction in gun ownership, we would see a 17% reduction in gun-related murders. So again, we have the same kind of a question. We see a reduction in gun ownership relating to a reduction in gun murders, not necessarily a reduction in murders in general. And so when we're looking at guns, are we looking at them as a tool, or are we looking at them as the driving factor behind murder? So that brings us to a set of important considerations. The first thing is that regardless of what this data would show us, correlation does not equal causation. So regardless of whether the two trend down or the two trend up together, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're factors of one another. Especially when we're considering a topic like murder, there's many motivators at play here. For example, poverty. Poor people who don't have access to food might do extreme things to get food or shelter or things like that. Education. Less educated people might not have the same understanding or grasp of the reality of murdering someone and the implications that can have. Social factors, that leads us to racial discrimination, for example, hate crimes, things like that. Heredity, mental instability, mental defects, people who aren't cognitive of what they're doing necessarily. The same thing can be said of drugs and alcohol. Someone who's not in their lucid mind is more likely to make a decision that someone who is of their right mind wouldn't. And then finally, access. So when we're talking about murders, sometimes this is a moment of passion, and so this is where maybe having access to guns in particular could make murder happen. If you were, for example, mad at someone and you started punching them, you may not necessarily kill them, whereas if you were to reach for a gun, you almost certainly could. So these are important considerations to think about as we look at this data set as we go. So where did I get the data from? So from the gun data was pulled from, it's called the Small Arms Survey. They've been running it since 2001 through the current year. And they survey 178 countries, many of them European. So this data was pulled for the guns from their website, and then some of it was on Wikipedia, so I aggregated that. And then murders is from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. For whatever reason, they keep very good statistics for Europe, the United Nations, but Europe in particular, for murders and things of that nature. So location quotient calculation. So how do we calculate the location quotient? We know what it is now, but how do we calculate it? So the LQ is the S of a country or region divided by the A of that area. So the S is the value for a given country or region, and A is the sum of all values that we're norming against. So it's a ratio, essentially. So let's look at an example of that. So for Albania, looking at the gun LQ, in Albania there's 157 total guns with a population of 2.7 million. That gives us a ratio of 0.000056. The region ratio is 0.000029. So when we divide those numbers from each other, we get an LQ of 1.97, or almost 2 to 1. So what that means is that Albania is 2 times the given density of guns as compared to the rest of the region. So how were my maps created? I created my maps using online GIS tools and Excel. I'm not very good with hand drawing things, so I opted to go the digital route. Like I said, the data was pulled from Wikipedia and these 2 online sources. I collected it in Excel, and then I had to adjust it all out, make sure I had the correct values for everything, and then all of my LQs were created that way. I uploaded that data into Target Maps, and Target Maps put it together in a nice picture for me, and then I had to use Paint to put some things like the tables and the map headers and things like that on the final images. So what does all this work give us? Unfortunately, it gives us imperfect data. So it turns out that getting murders and population for European countries is actually almost trivial. We had almost all of it. But gun information, especially against the population, like gun totals, was a lot harder to come by. So here's a list of countries where we didn't have that. So for Andorra, we didn't have guns. Belarus, Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic didn't have murders, but those were the only 3. Italy, Kosovo, Liechtenstein, Macedonia, and Monaco, we didn't have gun data for. And Liechtenstein, we had surprisingly neither. So these ones were omitted from the data set, obviously, because I couldn't compare and contrast the 2. So we get some interesting outliers here. We see that Ireland has a 10.4 gun LQ, and then Greenland for gun and murder LQ is very high. So the gun LQ is 65.6, and their murder LQ is also quite high, 6.8. So very, very high numbers compared to the rest of the area. So now when we're looking at upper and lower limits, one of the very first things we would expect to see is a correlation here. And so we do for Greenland. We see Greenland has lots of guns, and we also see that Greenland has lots of murders. But we don't see the same looking at the rest of this data. And as we look into this, when we look at the maps, it'll be even more apparent. So for upper limits, we have Ireland has a lot of guns, Serbia has a lot of guns. But we don't see the same for murders. By contrast, we see that Russia has a lot of murders and Lithuania has a lot of murders. So interestingly enough, though, if we look at the lower limits, we'll see that Lithuania is on the lower limits for guns, even though they're on the upper limits for murders. Romania on the lower limits, Hungary, Iceland, Switzerland, and Slovenia for lower limits on murder. So if you want to live somewhere in Europe where there's not a lot of murders, move to Iceland if you can deal with the cold. Okay, so here's the map of our gun LQs. So you'll see right away Ireland is very red, Serbia, Iceland, and you also probably notice that the northern countries here, Norway and Sweden, Finland, also seem to have a high LQ for guns. And I would say that Ireland is probably surprising, but when we're looking at the northern countries, I wouldn't say that they are. When you tend to live in a more rural area where there's more woods, things, guns tend to be something that are important for hunting and self-defense and dealing with the weather and things like that. So I would say that's probably to be expected. So let's look at the murder LQs, this next slide here. And so what we don't see is a correlation here. So when we're looking at Iceland, Iceland was yellow before, is green. Ireland, the same thing, red before, green now. Serbia, yeah, okay, a little bit of tendency towards the yellow, but not so much. But let's look at Russia. Very red, lots of murders, but their gun ownership is quite low. And so just looking at the map at a first glance, we're not seeing a strong correlation necessarily. Even when looking at the northern countries, Norway and Finland, we're not seeing as dark of a yellow as we did in the previous slide, for example. So here's the graph of the two LQs together, gun ownership and murder. And so on the bottom left here, we would expect to see low gun ownership LQs and low murder LQs. And as we move to the right, we would see higher gun ownership LQs and higher murder LQs. And that's not what we see, in fact. If anything, we would say that as we go to the left, it seems to be the lower gun LQs seem to be more unstable in the murder. So we're definitely not seeing a trending up and to the right as we might expect if these two were correlated. So here's two other slides. These are not adjusted LQs. These are just the raw numbers. And so this is number of murders and number of guns. So as we move to the right, we have more guns, and then upwards vertically would be the number of murders. And so again, we don't see some sort of a trend that, you know, the more number of guns directly means more murders, even if we're not adjusting them with an LQ correctly. We do see Russia kind of standing out as both high guns and high murders, interestingly enough. And so here's murders by population. So again, as we move to the right, the populations are increasing, and we do start to see that there are more murders as the population increases, and we would expect that. This isn't adjusted data, so this isn't percentages. This is just total number of murders, more people. So when there's more people, there's going to be more murders. So this is pretty much what we expected, and I wanted to graph this just because I wanted to see something that I would have expected as we did this. So this is just that data. So what does all of this tell us? Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us that much. We do not see a correlation. So while current studies suggest and even have models to predict that more guns would mean more murder, we don't actually see that correlation when looking at the raw data, at least in Europe. So what can we take away from this? Murders and guns don't necessarily go hand in hand, but that doesn't mean that guns don't make murder easier. We do know, however, that having access to these guns doesn't necessarily mean that people are more likely to kill. So my takeaway from this personally is that the other studies, at least in the United States, suggest that more gun ownership means more gun murders. And so my take on that would be that more gun murders simply means that more murders are occurring with guns because guns are the easiest tool for the job, not that more people are murdering. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Take care.